Hello, welcome to my pipeline integrity video series. My name is Colin Scott. I'm your presenter. I'm a pipeline integrity engineer based out of Calgary, Alberta, up in Canada. This video is going to be part of my crack stability video series. This is part 2. Hopefully some of you have already seen part 1 where I look at edge cracks in finite thickness pipe wall. In this particular video, I'm going to be looking at crack arrays. So this is work that is applicable to people that do work with stress corrosion cracking colonies, where you've got multiple parallel cracks that all influence each other and have a shielding effect. It becomes very, very important for the crack stability considerations, as I'll demonstrate. Now, in part 1 of my video, I talked a little bit about the fracture mechanics basics, which I think most of you will be quite familiar with. When we look at Irwin's equation, we have a definition of the stress intensity factor K, which is going to be a function of the geometry of the component, the applied stress, and the square root of pi times the crack depth. And our simple fracture criterion is that fracture will occur when the applied stress is high enough such that the applied K stress intensity factor is greater than the toughness of the material. That's a fairly simple way to look at things, but it's our starting point. Those of you familiar with fracture mechanics will know that there are a lot of nuances that come into play here. The nuance that we're interested in today is looking at whether our crack growth is stable or unstable. And what that comes down to is taking a look at the K gradient, the stress intensity factor gradient with respect to the crack depth. Now, if it's lower than the toughness gradient, we'll get stable crack growth. If it's higher than the toughness gradient, we'll get unstable crack growth. And so it becomes very, very important to understand how our stress intensity is changing as the crack grows. Today I'm going to be talking about work from 2 very important industry references. One is Patterson Irwin, the Stress Analysis of Cracks Handbook. I'm looking at the 3rd edition, which was 2000, but I think some of you might have some older editions from the early 70s. I think most of you involved in the fracture mechanics business will be familiar with this. It's really a very, very good compendium of different crack geometries and the associated stress intensity factors. The second industry reference is something that I'm guessing many of you will not be familiar with. It's called Stability of Arrays of Multiple Edge Cracks, and it's a paper that I found in the Engineering Fracture Mechanics journal from 1999, and it's written by a man named Parker. I will say that this is a very, very interesting paper from my perspective, and anybody who's interested in stress corrosion cracking, I highly recommend it. It is, I'll say it's not an easy read, but it's certainly worth taking a look at. There's some very, very important philosophies in there that I think is very pertinent to the stress corrosion cracking work that we're doing. So if I look at Patterson Irwin from the 2003 edition, if I dig through their compendium, I find this very, very interesting stress intensity factor solution for a periodic edge crack array in a semi-infinite solid. Here you can see on the right that there's a schematic showing multiple parallel cracks of depth A, and there's a spacing between them of 2h. Now, it might not be apparent why they have a spacing of 2h rather than just h, but it comes down to the way that they're doing their mathematical derivation. You'll see also that they define a spacing parameter S, which is equal to A, the crack depth, divided by A, the crack depth, plus H, the half crack spacing. And that turns into a very, very important thing to think about as we see how they derive their stress intensity factors. So here we have a plot of the solution to the stress intensity factor calculation that's determined by Patterson Irwin. On the y-axis, in this particular format, we have essentially the stress intensity factor, and on the x-axis we have this spacing parameter, A over A plus H. Now, I need to tell you that the way that the stress intensity factor has been defined here is not the usual. It's not done in terms of the square root of the crack depth. In this case, they've manipulated the curve in order to make it the square root of the crack half spacing. And that's a very unusual way to look at it, but it's quite necessary because of the way the derivation plays out. Now you'll see that the green line that defines what we're looking at essentially shows how the stress intensity factor is going to change as our spacing parameter changes. And when you look at the way that they've manipulated it, it basically says that if you have a constant crack spacing, which of course we will have, going from left to right on the plot basically describes what's going to happen to our stress intensity factor as a crack propagates, or in fact, as all of those cracks propagate. Now, what's interesting is you'll see that that stress intensity factor rises gradually, just as we would expect it to, but it actually reaches a plateau when we get to a spacing ratio of 0.4. That becomes very, very important. At that point, the stress intensity factor is at about 1.04. We see that plateau. After the plateau, the stress intensity factor actually declines. And that's a very important thing, because that's telling us that from a thermodynamic perspective, the stress intensity factor, or the strain energy release rate, hypothetically, mathematically goes down. And that is not something that we would expect to see in practice. Here I've taken that original curve and I've considered the situation where we have a crack spacing of just 2. I'm thinking in terms of perhaps millimeters, where we might have a crack growing, but there's a crack spacing between cracks in the colony of approximately 2 millimeters. And let's see how that plays out. What this shows us from this plot is that a crack will grow to 2/3, a depth of 2/3, in this case millimeters, and then we'll see a plateau in that normalized stress intensity curve. I've shown that with the red box. That's exactly the same plateau that we saw earlier on, except that I'm applying it to a more realistic crack depth and spacing than we saw before in the hypothetical situation. Now, we know that looking at the K gradient is going to be important to our crack stability considerations, and what we see there is very, very informative. Here I take a look at the normalized K gradient, and I apologize that this curve is a little bit wobbly because I was reading points off of that curve manually and then plugging them into my computer and doing this K gradient numerically. Now what you'll see is at the point where the crack depth is 2/3 of a millimeter, our normalized K gradient actually crosses our axis. So that represents exactly the point where we're going to stabilize our crack and we would expect to get no further growth. We see from the curve that if there were further growth, we would have negative K gradient, and that's just not reasonable. Unless, of course, we were to have a crack that was going into an increasingly brittle material, which is not something we're going to think about too much here. Now, this implies that a crack is going to go dormant once it reaches 2/3 depth. I think anybody that's familiar with stress corrosion cracking and is up on the industry literature will know that it's quite common for cracks to go dormant. There are various explanations for this. I'm going to be looking at it entirely from the perspective of the fracture mechanics and the K considerations. There are some people that will argue that cracks will go dormant, but then ultimately come back to life and continue to propagate. And that's something that has been addressed by Parker, the author of the paper that I mentioned before. Now, in 1999, in Parker's paper, he came up with a very interesting philosophy on how cracks behave. He basically stated that when the crack depth divided by the spacing ratio is equal to 1/3, the cracks become thermodynamically metastable. And we see that in the plateau of the curve. The A/2H ratio of 1/3 exactly corresponds to that spacing ratio we saw earlier of 0.4. Now, Parker argues that the array experiences crack shedding, and what that means is that 2/3 of all the cracks will shed. They'll essentially go dormant and take no further, make no further propagation. And the remaining 1/3 of all the cracks will continue to propagate, but with a new spacing of A/2H of 1/9. Now, Parker has demonstrated this in several different natural phenomena, including mud cracking, permafrost cracking, basalt column cooling, and also showing some cracking in gun tubes. It's very similar to our stress corrosion cracking phenomenon. you'll see that I have another video in my series that's called SCC shielding factors, and that gives us a bit more detail on how that plays out. I encourage you to take a look at that video if you're interested in this type of work. So if we presume that we're going to have this crack shedding phenomenon, then our cracks, or at least a third of them, will continue to grow. So here I've considered the situation that we have initial cracking in blue with a spacing of 2 units, in this case, for example, millimeters. But then once the crack shedding occurs, we will have a new effective crack spacing of 6 millimeters, and that's represented by the orange curve. You'll see that the normalized K is actually jumped up a little bit, but then continues to increase, but at an increasingly slower rate. Once our cracks reach a depth of 2, that being 1/3 of the shed spacing of 6, we're actually going to see a plateau in that first round of shedding, which can in principle cause a second round of shedding that's shown by the gray curve. When we go to the second sequence of shedding, we now have an effective crack spacing of 18. Again, the normalized K increases, but the curve does plateau. If we want to look at the K gradient, we'll see a similar behavior than we saw before. So our initial cracking, the normalized K gradient drops to 0. It initiates shedding, shown by the orange. As the 1/3 of those cracks continue to grow to a depth of 2 millimeters, you get a second sequence of shedding, and that's shown by the gray. Now this is a very, very important phenomenon because this is showing you that from a fracture mechanics perspective, and specifically from a crack stability perspective, your stress corrosion cracks, as they propagate, are increasingly shielding each other and are always in the process of stabilizing themselves by the sheer nature of the thermodynamics. And that's a very, very important thing. This tells you mathematically that your cracks will stabilize. Now, I have to say that that's not the whole story, because we do know that that stress corrosion cracks will fail occasionally, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is the cracks may well find themselves in a domain where fatigue becomes an issue, and secondly, and from my perspective here more importantly, at this point we have not considered the effect of having a finite width of pipe wall that we're propagating into. That will be the topic of my next video. However, I think that looking at these plots really does demonstrate some very important and informative information on how our stress corrosion cracks are going to self-stabilize as they propagate, as they start to shield each other. So what are the implications here? We know that stress corrosion cracking is initially stable. You'll see in the literature that it's well established that cracks can go dormant. And I've indicated here that the crack stability is a function of the crack depth and length, the component geometry, and that includes the crack colony spacing. So I really have to raise the question of, when we do laboratory test geometries, are these test geometries appropriate for pipeline conditions? Are the laboratory test geometries appropriate to demonstrate those crack stability considerations? I'm not so sure that they are, and it makes me wonder if maybe there's more information that we can potentially glean out of those laboratory test geometries that might not be apparent. I also have to think forward and ask, can we infer the crack growth rates from the stability considerations? In my previous video, I indicated that it's reasonable to infer that your crack growth rates will be high if you have a less stable crack, and our crack growth rates will decrease as crack stability increases. And I also have to ask the question, can material toughness gradients be inferred from these stability considerations? I think the answer is probably yes, though things are going to get quite complicated as we deal with K1 SCC, which is a bit of a tricky beast to deal with. We also need to think from an integrity perspective, can we actually predict or infer when crack dormancy will occur? And if the answer to that is yes, can we actually find conditions under which crack dormancy is encouraged? It seems to be that mathematically, if we can find a scenario in which our applied stress acting on those cracks is sufficient to maintain crack dormancy, we might be able to solve a big part of the SCC issue relatively simply. Obviously, there's a lot of testing that needs to be done, and a lot of people have to have this conversation and conclude that it is a realistic phenomenon that we're seeing here. Now, I hope I've given you a few things to think about. Some of this is not really intuitive, and some of it requires that you have a very good understanding of fracture mechanics. If you've read the Parker paper and, importantly, actually understood it, I think you'll be several steps ahead of the game. But I hope I've given you a few things to think about. The stress intensity factor considerations, and specifically crack stability associated with that K gradient, does indicate that your stress corrosion cracks will move towards more stable geometries and self-stabilize under certain conditions. Now, I still have to look at how that back wall correction factor is going to change things, and I'm going to look at that in part 3 of this video series. If you're interested in some further viewing, as I mentioned, I do have a video that's called Pipeline Integrity SCC Shielding Factors. That one I'll say is really for advanced viewers only. It does get quite complicated. And what I'm doing there is I'm building on the work of Parker, which, as I mentioned, I think is a very good piece of work. I strongly recommend anybody in the stress corrosion cracking business take a look at it and see if they follow my arguments here on the phenomenon of crack shedding. And I'd also like to say that I have used some of this work to build depth correction factors into my GEM methodology. My GEM methodology is a new approach to calculating failure pressures of stress corrosion cracking flaws. You can find that video also on YouTube and see if that makes any sense to you. Thank you very much if you've lasted this long. I hope that I've given you something to think about, and maybe it fits into some of the work that you're doing. If you have any thoughts either for or against this philosophy, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or YouTube, and I'll see what I can do to respond to any comments. Until then, thank you for your time, and have a good day.